Every interest shall vest within 21 years of the last life in being at the conveyance of the interest.
This declaration shall continue in effect until 21 years after the death of the last survivor of the descendant of King Charles III, King of England, living as of the date of this declaration. Hey, Ben, can you recite the rule against perpetuities?
What, from memory?
Yeah.
From memory. The rule against perpetuities. Every interest shall vest within 21 years of the last life in being at the conveyance of the interest.
That's first year of law school right there, property class. The reason I bring that up is this interesting thing that we see going on between the state of Florida and Disney. You have a board that has basically been governing the area that Disney's resort is on. It's like 27,000 acres, huge plot of land.
It's a big
that
place.
They govern.
If you've ever been there, and, Disney World is a very, very big place. Just letting you know.
And it includes all of their properties, not only the parks.
Yeah, it's pretty much all of Lake Buena Vista, Florida, which was apparently like a giant mangrove swamp that they purchased in the 60s and then spent about a decade building out Disney World, and then the last 5 decades building out all of the surrounding resorts and amusement parks and hotels and everything else. It's a giant community.
And they're basically, for the past 50 or so years, have been governing that area autonomously. And so there's a dispute going on between the state of Florida for political reasons and Disney. The governor named a new board, and before they took their place on the board, the previous board, which was basically controlled primarily by people loyal to Disney, passed an agreement between this governing body that includes the rule against perpetuities and basically takes away all of the power that this new board is going to have. They're not going to have really any power or authority to do anything because of this new agreement.
So just let me make sure I read this right, because I haven't read the articles that you're referencing. And my understanding is that there was some type of oversight board that was either Florida taxpayers paid for, like the government, I don't know, but there was this oversight board that Governor DeSantis was about to replace the membership of or create a new board. I'm not exactly sure. But anyway, just prior to the new board taking power, whether it be by new individuals or a new board, the old board basically made a ruling that keeps Disney's autonomy for a very, very long time. Is that right?
Yeah, and it included a royal clause. And basically to
Disney in the Magic Kingdom would they include a royalty clause? What does the royalty clause have to do with anything?
So we have the rule against perpetuities. You know, we're not property lawyers. We deal with personal injury law and helping people get compensated when they've been injured. But in property class, we learned about this rule against perpetuities, and it's basically preventing somebody who has property and they're trying to pass it on, so that they don't want the dead hand to control a property interest for too long into the future.
But basically, if you convey property to someone, so let's say that I grant I give you property, and there's numerous ways that I can classify that property. You have different interests. Now, nowadays, everybody, you purchase the property, you own the property, and it's known as fee simple, okay? That's basically what we think of today, that anybody who buys property, you own it, and you own it until you die, right? In the feudal days, when property law was first coming into play, people didn't own the property outright a lot of times. So you could convey property to someone, and you could put numerous conditions on it. There were various types of estates. And so one of the common ones was a life estate. So people would deed property to someone else, and they would say, okay, I'm conveying to you a life estate on this property, and then that means you own it until you die. But then the life estate, when the person dies, what happens to the property? Well, it reverts back to the original owner if the owner's still alive. So then there are all these ways that you could convey property by writing this up. And one of the things that's like a limitation on it, because theoretically you could say, okay, so it's for my grandmother as a life estate. She lives 10 years, whatever. And then it shall be vested, or it shall be conveyed to my grandson, who will own it in fee simple, meaning he owns it permanently after she dies. So one of the limitations on this, because you could just start conveying the property over and over again, you could literally just do it forever and say, after this person dies, it's this person. And then after this, it happens, it's going to go to this person. So they had a rule that's called the rule against perpetuities, which is a great name for anything. And this is the rule against perpetuities. And everybody has to spend about 2 days in law school trying to figure out what this means and how it works. And it's anytime you convey property to someone, to this day, it cannot violate the rule against perpetuities, which is in various forms, but traditionally, every interest shall vest not more than 21 years after the last life in being at the time of the conveyance. So tell people what that means, Patrick.
I think you're doing pretty good at it, so I'll leave that to you.
So you got to unpack it. Now, the idea is that when you convey that property, once somebody who is alive, one of your heirs, is alive at the time of the conveyance, once that person passes away, the last person who was alive at the time you conveyed this property, when they die, then it's over, plus 21 years. Okay, when they die, plus 21 years, then it has to be over. You can't convey an interest that's going to just go on forever. You basically have a limitation on it that's got some kind of definable point that is very difficult to unpack. But in this case, it's just particularly interesting.
It is. And it's basically just so that a dead hand can't remain in control over a piece of property. Yeah, you don't remember that from law school?
No, I recall, but explain to the people what you mean by the dead hand. Things that we accept.
Well, I mean, here's another one that might bring back law school memories: Blackacre, right? If you convey Blackacre to somebody, and then upon your death, it's going to go to X, and if not X, then Y. If not Y, then Y's children. If not Y's children, then W's children, or so forth and so on. Then the person that originally owned the property is going to continually control this property long past
by drafting something
his death.
After this happens, this happens. After this happens, this happens.
Yeah, and it's the
limitation on it.
Yeah, you don't want somebody who died in 1900 to be controlling the property that Disney sits upon up into 2025, right? I mean, that would be ridiculous.
And this is something that, frankly, in 10 years, since we graduated from law school, or at least I did, I don't think I've for a single moment thought or talked about the rule against perpetuities, but it came up a lot in law school. And property lawyers, especially probate attorneys, encounter it a lot, because when you're drafting wills, the rule against perpetuities is something that you do have to take into account sometimes and make sure you're not violating Georgia's rule against perpetuities or Texas's rule against perpetuities, whichever it is. If you're basically conveying property through an inheritance, that the things have to happen within a reasonable amount of time, or it's considered an invalid conveyance and the person doesn't get what you're trying to give them because it violates the rule against perpetuities. It's one of those things in law school where it's almost like it's such a complicated concept. They're trying to test you if you're like capable. If you can make sense of this, you can be a lawyer. If you're struggling with this, you can still be a lawyer, but like you're gonna miss this question on the bar, because it's apparently always on the bar exam. There's a rule against perpetuities question. Everybody just has to know it. And I don't recall if I got that question right or not. Perhaps we'll never know. They just give you a score at the end.
Well, here it is in application. So Disney's prior board made a last-minute agreement with Disney. And in that agreement, they deemed this agreement effective on the date that it was entered into.
Which was like last month, right? Like February of 2023.
Yeah. And this is what it says. This declaration shall be deemed effective as of the effective date and continue to be effective in perpetuity. Okay, so there's that word. Unless all or certain portions of the provisions of this declaration are expressly terminated. Provided that if the perpetual term is deemed to violate the rule against perpetuities, this declaration shall continue in effect until 21 years. Here it is. So this declaration shall continue in effect until 21 years after the death of the last survivor of the descendants of King Charles III, King of England, living as of the date of this declaration. Isn't that crazy?
We've got a board in Florida that's making this momentous decision about how Disney World, which probably I think is the largest employer in the country, is going to rule itself in Florida and to prevent the state from coming in and being able to take over some of those ruling powers. The board said, well, we're going to grant this authority hereby as of this moment in perpetuity, or at least so long as any survivors of the heirs of King Charles III, who just is about to take the throne in England, is deceased. So whatever happens, it's a very, very long time that will outlive anybody in this room. That's crazy. I wonder how in the world they came up with, let's go with the heirs of King Charles III. I don't know if like traditionally, and I mean, that must be really traditional, that you would base it on the king at the time. That's was probably common in the era of rule against perpetuity issues that came up in feudal economies. But that's bizarre, man.
I found this in the Guardian newspaper,
It's a British newspaper.
which is a British newspaper, and it said,
of course, it should be
what?
21 years against the last survivors of King Charles. Of course, that's when everything vests around here.
Well, this is what they said. They said royal clauses of this kind are used to avoid rules in some places against contracts which last in perpetuity. The British royal family was chosen for the clauses because information about the family tree was readily available, but also because of the better health care available to and longer life expectancy of a royal family member compared to a non-royal.
Now, that is a good point, because I think the Queen just died at 95. Like, wasn't she close to 100 years old or something like that?
Yeah.
So probably pretty smart. So basically they chose it because I think that was a traditional thing to do, and that there's no dispute because it's common knowledge who the heirs are. So one of the things that can happen in a rule against perpetuity situation, this was a common law school puzzle that they would throw at you, is that somebody would come up and go, oh, no, it hasn't. There's another heir that nobody was aware of. And so now that person has to die before the property would come back. And it's really like not a thing that you would look and say, oh, okay, well, it's a limitation on something. So it's not really that you're waiting for something to happen. It's that the contract to be enforceable, or the conveyance to be enforceable, has to make sure that everything has to happen before these survivors pass away. And so you look at who the heirs are at the time of the conveyance, and then would all of these things have to happen before the last person dies? And if you can show that it is possible that it could go beyond that, then it's too perpetual. It violates the rule against perpetuities. That's my memory of it.
Yeah.
We'll have to get a proper in this in a follow-up episode.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see Florida's response to this, because they're obviously going to try to get this agreement thrown out. I think they said that Florida views it as a subversion of the will of the voters and the legislature and the governor. That just sounds crazy. Here you have a district that's been carved out specifically for a company that's operating within a state that's autonomous from the state in many, many ways. It's called the Reedy Creek District.
Yeah. The history of Disney, there's been a lot written about this, and we'll have to go into the history books to see how this came about. But I know that in general, that when Disney purchased the property and everything, I mean, this was swampland, and this was nothing at all like Orlando as we know it today. I mean, this was all purchased in the 50s or the 60s, and it was basically Disney was given as a company, which was still run by Walt Disney, carte blanche to do whatever they wanted to do. And the state of Florida wanted this there. There were other areas of the country that were vying to get the East Coast Disney World. By this time, Disneyland had been very successful on the West Coast. They wanted an East Coast version. And I've even heard that there were places in Georgia that were being considered for Disney World. And eventually it went to Orlando. And I think that it was basically like they were given just carte blanche to do whatever they wanted to do. And that part of that was complete autonomy about how they would run the parks and rule the parks. So even though you're in such a large place that it seems like a community, you're really in a giant store. So they have the same kind of rights that a store has for security and all of these other things. Like the police can't just come into the store. If there's like an emergency or something, obviously can, but Disney has its own fire departments. It has its own, security forces. It has all of this stuff that is really separate from the state. And I think people are just now becoming aware of that since these controversies have arisen. And the state of Florida is going, it might be time to rethink how we deal with Disney in Florida, because they kind of consider themselves the Munich of Florida, where they're basically just in the equivalent of Munich when it was in East Germany. They were like this autonomous city that didn't have to abide by the laws of where it was geographically located. It's almost like it's the Vatican in Italy, right? It's geographically located in Italy, but it's autonomous and not part of Italy, is almost how Disney World, I think, likes to think of themselves in Florida.
It says Reedy Creek Improvement District, which DeSantis has renamed the Central Florida Tourism Oversight District, allowed Disney World to expand and operate with a high amount of autonomy. In writing, the new board will end Disney's long practice of taxing itself to develop on the 25,000 unincorporated acres sandwiched between Osceola and Orange counties. It'll oversee services like sewage treatment and maintain the local roads, as well as decide how much Disney will pay for those services.
They have private security. You don't see Florida policemen when you're inside the resort. You say to somebody that's not been there, when you're inside the resort, that means like there's a big gate and miles of road that go all around these parks and everything. Once you're inside those gates, it's all private security. You really notice it when you're staying at some of the resorts that are on the Disney property, which there are numerous ones, and it's growing all the time. There's even like the transportation. They just had the sky buckets put in, and I'm sure that was extremely expensive. Disney pays for all that, right? It's not taxpayer money. It's all private. So once you're within the gates, as far as Disney is concerned, you're in their store at that point. It's like you're not in the state of Florida anymore. You're not in Kansas. You're in Disney World.
That's interesting. They have their own cities. They have the city of Lake Buena Vista, Disney-controlled city of Bay Lake and Lake Buena Vista. That's wild.
Yeah, and Lake Buena Vista is where a lot of the hotels are located. There's a town of Disney Springs in Lake Buena Vista. I mean, that's where you find the Holiday Inn and you find all of these normal hotels that you're used to seeing, but they're still located on property owned by Disney. I mean, they own everything down there.
Wow. That is very interesting.
It's also odd when you get down there. It's like it's being in a place where everything that's there was created sometime after 1970. It's like an entire metropolis around Orlando and everywhere else. Like literally there was nothing there except for a tiny town of Orlando, which was really small. And everything you see has been built in my lifetime, which is 46 years, as I'm sure you know.
So there's a book called Married to the Mouse, Walt Disney World in Orlando by Richard Fogelsong. Disney had issues previously with the government of Anaheim, California at its Disneyland park, which was completed a decade before 1967 when the special district was created in Florida. And so Disney pushed for a special purpose district in Florida that would give the company the ability to self-govern. In exchange, Florida became the home base of Disney World and its millions of tourists. And there's a lot of them there. Part
of the reasoning for relocating is that they didn't have room to expand. Disney World is a lot bigger than Disneyland. Disneyland is in Anaheim and is basically like the Magic Kingdom Park, as it's called in Florida, whereas they had kind of grander plans to create all of these communities, which included Epcot, where people originally were going to live, and then They eventually built all of it out. Disney Springs is where they have shopping and people can work and live in Disney Springs area. I mean, it's massive. I don't think if anybody's ever been there, you think of Disney World as just being this amusement park like a Six Flags or something, but that park is, but it's just one of several parks that are located there. And then in addition to the parks, you have these resort areas that are giant with multiple giant resorts and with huge Vegas style pools and everything else. I mean, it is just a massive property. And I think that it's been a balance for the state of Florida, which the state of Florida owes a lot of its tourism to Disney World being there, right? Prior to Disney World being there, I think people went to Miami Beach and that was about it. And all of Florida tourism really blossomed after World War II. And it started to boom after the 1970s when Disney started bringing millions of people every year to the central part of the state, where there was absolutely nothing prior to that.
And it'll be interesting to see how the state of Florida deals with this. They're going to obviously challenge this agreement, and it's always interesting to see people jockeying for power. Especially, I mean, like you said, they employ a lot of people. They employ over 75,000 people. That's huge.
Yeah, be sure to like our channel, and we would really appreciate it if you subscribe.